Having good self-talk is not just about being positive, right? It's not always about saying nothing is wrong, everything's going well within my game. Because the truth is, when you've been making a lot of mistakes or you've been playing poorly, positive self-talk won't do much good if you're trying to be positive by telling yourself that was a fine game, everything was okay with that game, if the honest truth is it wasn't. You played a poor game. You made mistakes. So it's not just always about being positive, but it is about being optimistic. Now, I was on a coaching call the other day with an athlete, and we were talking about the difference between the types of tones that he takes when he is talking to himself. And we were going over this idea because he and I have really been focusing on his thinking. Now, I made a video just a few days ago about the importance of your thinking as an athlete, and the reason that it's so important to control your thinking is because of this thing called the thought, feeling, action cycle, where your thinking is impacting your emotions, and then your thinking and your emotions is causing you to play a certain way, right? So it's impacting your actions. A really simple example is if you're thinking, I hope I don't make mistakes, then you end up feeling scared of making mistakes, and so then your play will probably be timid, and you'll hesitate and you'll hold yourself back. Now, I've put a link right here if you would like to go ahead and watch that video as well to learn a little bit more about the importance of controlling your thinking. But within this episode, I'm really discussing this idea of having more optimistic thinking. So that basketball player, he's a basketball player. He and I were talking a lot about, the tone that he's taking when he's talking to himself. And I gave him the example of where I said, that last game wasn't a very good game. That statement in and of itself appears pretty negative. And for the most part for him, it is negative because he's continuing to say that last game wasn't very good, and he's beating himself up over it. But if we can take a different tone, right, a different way, a way of looking at it, where he says, that game wasn't that good, but the next game will be better. Right? So we're taking a different tone with the way that we are looking at that game in terms of the language that we're using with ourselves. Instead of saying, man, that game wasn't very good. He says, that game wasn't that good. And then he follows it up with, but, I'll do better the next time, or but I'll learn from it next time, or I'll learn from it, work on that during practice, or whatever it ends up being. But that's where we're taking more of this optimistic tone to the way that we are talking to ourselves and the way that we are looking at our games as a whole. And it's really important that you are taking this optimistic outlook, right, on your game, and you're having more optimistic thinking, because at the end of the day, there's very little that we can control about the outcomes of our performance and the result of our performance. But one thing that we can always control is the way that we are looking at our game and the way that we are looking at ourselves. And what I mean by looking at is, how are we talking to ourselves about our game? How are we talking to ourselves about ourselves? Another example is a soccer player that I was talking with earlier today, and he and I were talking about this idea of really making sure that between his practice sessions and between his matches, he's paying attention to the type of language that he's using. And when he does think back to the mistakes that he made, or he thinks about the upcoming game, we just want to be having more of an optimistic attitude. This doesn't always mean that he has to say things were going well, because he and I were talking about how, he hates to try to cover up the mistakes that he made. If he made the mistakes, he wants to look at the mistakes he made. But we have to make sure that he's looking at those mistakes, once again, with this optimistic outlook, more of this optimistic attitude. So really, this is all about the approach that you're taking to the way you decide to look at your game. And it doesn't always feel like you have the choice as to what you're going to see when you look at your game. I have a lot of athletes that tell me they don't feel like they deserve to look at their game in an optimistic way, or they don't deserve to talk positively to themselves if they have been playing poorly. And I get that 100%, right? I've been there myself. I know many athletes who feel that way. But the truth is, if you feel like you don't deserve to look at your game optimistically, where you say, I think I'll be able to turn things around. I think I know I'll be able to play well my next game. I'll be able to work on that. It was a mistake, but I think I can improve it. If you feel like you don't deserve to look at your game that way until you play well, you're just prolonging the next time that you play well. because we need to be looking at our game in this optimistic way. We need to be thinking about ourselves in more of this positive and optimistic way in order to turn our game around. I work with a lot of players who are in slumps, right? And a lot of them are baseball and softball hitters, but there are also basketball players who haven't scored in a few games, and many other sports who where they haven't had wins in a few matches or a few games, and they feel like they're really struggling. And one of the things that we talk a lot about with slumps is that most of the slump has to do with the way that you've responded to bad games and the way that you've responded to mistakes that you've made. And the more that you dig yourself that hole and you dig it deeper, where you're getting down on yourself, you're having more of this pessimistic outlook. Oh, I don't know when I'll be able to turn it around. I'm just not playing very well right now. Everything's not going my way. The more you dig yourself into that hole deeper, the harder it is to turn your game around. But really mentally tough athletes are able to have this optimistic outlook, this positive type of thinking, even when things are not going well. Because again, this goes back to the idea that I mentioned earlier, where there are so few things about sports that are within an individual athlete's control. And one of the main things that's always within your control is your attitude. And we can simplify, we can kind of summarize your attitude to be your thoughts and your emotions. Well, your emotions aren't always in your control because they're much more difficult to control than your thinking, but your thinking is always in your control, right? If you put the effort in to have your thinking in your control, then your emotions all of a sudden become more in your control. And then the attitude that you take, right? The approach that you're taking to your game, the way you're looking at your game, the perspective you're taking, that all of a sudden becomes much more in your control. And it becomes much more helpful to the result of your performance because you're trying to have this optimistic and positive outlook and this optimistic attitude. So for yourself, I really encourage you to analyze your game right now and ask yourself, am I really taking as optimistic of an outlook as I can? How am I talking to myself? Am I using this optimistic language where I say, the last game wasn't that great, but I know that I can learn from it and I know that I can improve next time? Or are you simply saying that last game sucked? I suck. I'm terrible. I'll never win. And think about, what is the language doing to your chances of success? Are you helping yourself bounce back, or are you holding yourself back based on the way that you're talking to yourself? So analyze your game, analyze yourself, and really work on having more of this optimistic attitude, right? This optimistic way of talking to yourself. And I promise you're going to see your game improve, because the better we talk to ourselves, the better we think, the better we end up playing. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I put out new videos each week on sports psychology and mental training. And if you have any questions about the one-on-one coaching I offer or any of the sports psychology programs I have available, I've put links to those in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I wish you the best of success in all that you do.